Okay, I guess we're ready to get started again. Welcome back. We're going to begin our second session, which is on the collapse mechanisms. And I would like to introduce to you the moderators, Professor Frank DiMaggio, Chair, Professor Maciej Bieniek, and Professor Atli Jelzvik, all of Columbia University.
Welcome to this session on the collapse mechanisms. This has been the subject of intense discussion and speculation in the structural engineering community since the tragedy of September 11th. We hope that this session will spread at least a little light on the matter. I'd like to introduce one at a time our speakers. I won't spend much time on it so they get a lot of chance to speak. I'd like to ask first to speak Mr. Frank Lombardi, who is the Chief Engineer for the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey.
Thank you, Frank.
Divided place called and the walls came tumbling down. Oh, promised land, oh, promised land, oh, wicked ground, build a dream, tear it down. Oh, promised land, what a wicked ground, build a dream, watch it all fall down. Doctors have come from distant cities just to see me. Stand over my bed, disbelieving what they see. They say I must be one of the wonders, God's own creation. And as far as they see, they can offer no explanation. Newspapers ask intimate questions, want confessions. They reach into my head to steal the glory of my story. They say I must be one of the wonders, God's own creation. And as far as they see, they can offer no explanation. I believe fate smiled down You were the love for certain of my life. You were simply my beloved wife. I don't know for certain how I'll live my life now alone without my beloved wife, my beloved wife. Oh, I can't believe I've lost the very best of me. You are the love for certain of my life. You were simply my beloved wife. I don't know for certain how I'll live my life now alone without my beloved wife, my beloved wife. Oh, I can't believe I've lost the very best of me. You are the love for certain of my life. For 50 years, simply my beloved wife. With another love, I'll never lie again. It's you I can't deny. It's you I can't defy. A depth so deep into my grave. Without my beloved soul, I renounce my life as my right. Now alone without my beloved wife, my beloved wife, my beloved wife, my beloved wife. My love is gone, she suffered long, you know, so big. My love is gone, with candles, with flowers. He was one of ours. One of ours. Why don't you let him be? He's gone, we know. Give his mother and his father peace. You vulture scandal, you casual slander, you murdered his memory. He's gone, we know. It's nothing but a tragedy. Lay to rest your soul and body, lay beside your knee. Lay to rest your rage, your hunger, and amazing grace. With candles, with flowers, you were one of ours. One of ours. I saw cameras expose your life. I heard rumors explode with lies. I saw children in tears cry and crowd around the site of where you had collapsed that day, where your last breath and word had been sighed, where your heart had burst and where you had died, where you had died, where you had died. Somehow they were lost and grieving, all half believing you got everywhere. Oh, the loss and pain of your crime and the shame of it, you were gone. It was such a sight and raving, how can we save him from inside? Somehow they were lost and grieving, all half believing you were gone. The loss and pain of the crime and the shame of it, you were gone. Such a nightmare raving, how can we
Our next speaker is Dr. Charles Thornton, the chairman of Thornton Tomasetti, whose experience with high-rise buildings includes the design of the Petronas Towers in Kuala Lumpur. Dr. Thornton.
Thank you very much. I believe that this session is going to have less graphics than the other sessions. I checked with Matt also, and he doesn't have any. I think all three of us felt that to start showing graphics speculating on the exact mechanisms is a bit premature. So I'd like to see this session take less presentation and more interaction. During lunch upstairs, sitting with some of the faculty from Columbia, there's obviously a lot of brain power in this room that are more familiar with mechanics and impulse and momentum than maybe the people up here, including me. And so maybe there are some insights that we can get from the audience. The New York Times article, my compliments to Jim Glantz. It really does tell a pretty good story. I read it last night, and I said, maybe there's no need for this session. But you know what's interesting? There's been stuff coming in on the net. Professor Bazant from Northwestern started spreading around an article that he and a graduate student were writing. And I dug out my collection of articles coming up on the train this morning, and now that we're 6 weeks after the event, and the New York Times Glantz article and the Bazant article, and there was an interesting article called The Collapse of the World Trade Center Towers, written by G. Charles Clifton from a firm called HERA Structural Engineer, dated 17 September. I'm not even sure where I got this, but if you read it and you compare it to the Glantz article, he's pretty much right on. I'd like to sort of try to learn from events like the Trade Center. And let's go back to the Oklahoma City blast event at the Murrah Building. That building was designed perfectly. Gene Cawley, Meta Sozin, Paul Malacca, and I wrote the building performance assessment report on that. It's available from FEMA. It's free. The building was designed perfectly to the 1975 codes. The rebar detailing was impeccable. When you stood on the ground and you looked up, every rebar was built and placed the way it was supposed to be. The only problem was it didn't anticipate a 4,000-pound truck bomb parked 15 feet from the column. As a result of the Oklahoma City report, and we had a little controversy back and forth, the blast community, people who design buildings for blast, think that blast is blast and earthquake design is earthquake design, and there are definitely differences, durations, etc. But what I believe is that if you design for multi-hazards, if you look at all the threats and you back into the secondary threats after you've designed for the primary threats, you may end up with a more robust building, a building that will withstand those unanticipated demands that get placed. As a result of Oklahoma City, in part, FEMA and the National Institute of Building Sciences, NIBS, put together the Multi-Hazard Mitigation Council. And if people in the audience don't know much about it, you should, okay? Under NIBS is the Building Seismic Safety Council, the Metrification Council, and many other councils. But the one that I think is the most interesting, and I was on the formation committees, and I'm on the board right now, is the Multi-Hazard Mitigation Council. And what's fascinating about it is you sit in board meetings, and all the people who are involved in the World Trade Center investigation are all there. The fire, the terrorist, the hail, the storms, the tornadoes, the earthquake community. And the conclusion is that if you design for multi-hazards, you end up with a much, much better building. Now, it's the Multi-Hazard Mitigation Council, but right now it's focusing on natural hazards. I suspect that very, very soon after that September 11th event, that it's going to be also focusing on malevolent events or non-natural hazards. One of the things that I concluded from the Oklahoma City report, and I suspect that we're going to see some conclusions coming out about the World Trade Center, was introducing more redundancy, more robustness, maybe borrowing from our colleagues across the pond, the UK codes, who after the Ronan Point collapse in the late 60s, 68, introduced resistance to progressive collapse. And I think if you read the UK codes and you look at key elements and notional loads, minimum horizontal loads on structures that maybe are not in a geographic area that has big loads, and resistance to disproportionate collapse. And you go down to Washington and you look at the GSA standards and the Office of Foreign Building Standards for both blast and disproportionate collapse, you can end up with a significantly more robust building at not much added cost. On the Oklahoma City situation, and again, I want to reiterate, it was designed perfectly. There was nothing wrong with the design, but had the bottom steel been lapped on the beams on the facade of the building, and some of the statistics are that only 15% of the people that died would have died. 85% would have been saved. I showed a similar presentation 2 weeks ago to the Building Seismic Safety Council Board, who was meeting in Washington. I showed them the World Trade Center response photos as to what was going on. And I showed them some of the pictures of the Trade Center, its tube, its floor system, its connections. And the California people looked at it and said, oh, we could never do that in California. And it's obvious why they can't. They're in a Zone 4 seismic region. But the fact of the matter is that if you do design buildings for seismic forces, you have a whole added level of forces that are occurring in the superstructure that don't occur when you're designing for wind. I think what's going to happen is we're going to have much more performance-based design. Clients now are already starting to ask us. We've been designing institutional buildings for the last 10 years for blast and for resistance to progressive collapse. Institutions, private institutions, financial institutions, institutions who perceived that they were a target, okay? I believe that everybody now that owns a building over 40 stories perceives that they're a target. My anti-terrorist friends in Washington tell me that the hazard of a plane flying into a building is passé. The terrorists will figure out something bigger and better next time. So maybe flying planes into buildings is really not the next hazard. But I think no one can really define what these hazards are, but we can make buildings more robust and give them more resistance to progressive collapse. In the Oklahoma City report, we talked about introducing compartmentalization, somehow breaking the building up into more kinds of discrete areas, okay? The Hong Kong Code has refuge floors. To the best of my knowledge, they are not structural refuge floors, but they are refuge floors where you can get away from heat, smoke, and you have access to outside air, okay? My feeling is if there are outriggers added at mechanical floors at discrete locations up the building, that you might have a significantly better resistance to progressive collapse. And some of these things are in some of the buildings that are being designed around the world. As far as the exact sequence of the collapse is concerned, I think we all have our opinions. I would really like to get some response from some of the faculty in the audience. If there are any fire experts in the audience, I've spent a lot of time with the ASCE committee meeting relative to the Trade Center. I've spent a lot of time in Washington with fire experts. I now know more about fire and fire engineering than I did before September 11th. I don't know enough, and I think structural engineers should be a lot more cognizant of what goes on in buildings relative to fire. We shouldn't leave it to a code or an architect just saying 3 hours. I think we've got to get into more fire modeling. And so that's basically what I wanted to say, and Matt is going to tell you all about his theories on the mechanism. Thank you.
Our final speaker is Mr. Mattis Levy, who is a founding principal of Weidlinger Associates. Among the buildings that I associate with him are the Javits Convention Center, the Georgia Dome, some others. Mr. Levy.
It's always difficult to be the last speaker because everybody else, all the other speakers have already usurped all your material and you feel that you're left with very little to say. About a month ago, I was in Japan immediately or within weeks after the events of September 11th. And I was asked at that time to present to a very large audience some of the ideas or some of the speculation that I've been able to develop thinking about what actually happened to the World Trade Center buildings. In reality, I don't think we will ever be able to know exactly what happened and what the sequence of the failure was. We can only speculate and come to some intelligent or reasoned conclusions as to the exact mode of failure. The reason for this is that, unlike many other failures, this one left very little evidence, because the evidence was destroyed first in the fire that took place immediately after the event, and then the continuing smoldering fire that took place for many days and weeks thereafter. So if we were to recover pieces of the steel, for instance, in the area where the initial explosion took place, it would be very difficult to determine whether the cause of the failure was the initial impact, the subsequent fire, or the later smoldering fire that burned in the ground for many, many days. Therefore, there is no smoking gun that we can point to and say, well, that is the one point of collapse. What we can look at is what happened and what we think the sequence of events that took place came to cause the collapse of the buildings. One of the first things one notices is that the buildings were actually extremely robust. As Les Robertson pointed out this morning, he designed the buildings to take the impact of a 707. The 707 was substantially smaller than the 767 that actually came into the building. So the initial impact, which actually tore a tremendous number of columns out of the exterior face of the building, still left the building standing. It left the building standing because the exterior frame, that tube, that so important tube that formed the wind resistance and lateral resistance of the tower, really served a wonderful purpose, giving time to occupants to leave the building and also providing support for the building during the time that the fire was burning and other things were happening in the interior of the structure. Now the question comes up, what happened after the initial impact of the plane? First, if we look at the force of the initial impact and look at the momentum of the plane itself, well, the plane provided or had a momentum that would equal a fraction of the wind resistance of the structure, this tube structure that we talked about. So the initial impact simply did not cause any kind of a collapse of the building and did not cause the building to fail. The redistribution and redundancy that the tube provided allowed the forces to flow around the area of the failed columns. On the interior, it's a little more difficult to try to determine what took place because we didn't see it and very little evidence remains of what took place. The first we look at are the floors themselves. The floors were a relatively light construction, light trusses spanning between the exterior core and the exterior frame and the interior core. These light trusses with a concrete topping were undoubtedly severely damaged, and maybe one or two of them may have fallen onto floors below at the time of the impact of the planes. What else took place undoubtedly is that as a result of both the momentum of the plane and the fact that pieces of the plane went through the buildings, the interior columns, as has been described, were certainly damaged as a result of that impact. But furthermore, the blast of the fireball that took place immediately after most likely took away a lot of the fire protection that the interior columns had as their initial starting point. So one of the things that I feel is the most important in looking at the failure of the building is what happened on the interior rather than on the exterior. Because the exterior, really served us extremely well and was a wonderfully designed, provided a wonderfully designed structure against the lateral impact. If we look at what took place on the interior, if the columns, which were initially protected by fireproofing, suddenly lost their fireproofing, and if those columns then were heated by the fire that took place as a result of the burning jet fuel, and that fire has been estimated to have had temperatures of anywhere from 1,000 to 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. And as you know, steel will rapidly lose strength, and at about 1,100 degrees Fahrenheit has lost half its strength. If that were in fact what took place, and we're really only speculating because it's all we can do at this point, if that were in fact what took place, then the interior columns would have begun to weaken and soften. Those that were already damaged would have begun to buckle, and the interior core of the building would then have begun to fail, causing the upper floors to fall on the lower floors. That fall, which then would be an impact force, has been estimated by a number of people at anywhere from 10 to 30 times the weight of those upper floors. So that would have been enough to cause the pancaking of the floors below. So if it was the core that initially failed and not the exterior, and really there's no way of determining for certain which it was, certainly the columns, whether exterior or interior, were the initial cause of the failure, because the floors, or the failure of floors themselves, I do not believe would have been sufficient to cause the buildings to fail. So the question then is, what can we learn from this? And from every failure, obviously, we try to look for some lessons learned. The first is one that has been pointed out many times before, and that is the value of redundancy and the value of designing buildings for progressive collapse. The redundancy is clearly shown by the strength and the robustness of the tube of the buildings. The second is the question of what do we know and what do we do about fire? Charlie has mentioned the issue of fire, and I believe fire is really maybe one of the most important issues that we should really examine as a result of this collapse. We as engineers rarely deal with the effects of fire. We assume that if we follow the codes and if we follow the recommendations for fireproofing, that a building will then be safe. That is not always the case as shown in this particular instance, because if the fireproofing cannot survive and is not robust enough, then it can cause failure and damage. So I believe very strongly that we as engineers have to learn more and try to become more intelligent about the design of buildings against fire. Clearly, and this has been pointed out also by several of the speakers, we're not going to design buildings as fortresses. We want to design buildings as open, friendly places for occupants. Therefore, we're not going to design a building to survive the impact of a plane such as a 767, except for the case of the initial impact not causing an initial collapse of the building. We do not want any accident to happen as a result of initial impact, and that is what happened in this case. So if we design buildings for accidental forces and design it in such a way that those accidental forces will not cause progressive collapse, then we can be assured that failures can be arrested. And finally, we have to look at the question of robustness of our structures. There have been questions raised about what would, for instance, have happened to the core if the core had been built of concrete. Well, again, looking at the evidence, if you look at what happened to the Pentagon, which was, in fact, a concrete building, the plane went through it like butter. So that's not necessarily a perfect answer. Nevertheless, a concrete structure does provide a little greater degree of fire separation and possibly fire protection. So robustness is one area that we have to examine. And in conclusion, I'd like to again state what most of the other speakers have said, which is this building, these two buildings, were really designed splendidly, and they survived in a way that one would never have anticipated them to survive under such a severe and unexpected impact. Thank you.
Thank you. We will be accepting written questions. The students will be around collecting them. While I'm waiting for something from the floor, I'd like to ask first if any of the panelists would like to make a short additional statement. Sean? Okay. Professor Gjelsvik has a question.
Well, I have a modest experience in designing oil rigs in the North Sea. And after every disaster, and there's been a number of disasters, three questions always comes up for a revision of the relevant codes. And they are related to fireproofing, escape routes, and what you call the redundancy of the structure. So my question, which is in fact has been partly answered, is that should the building codes deal in much more detail with fireproofing, fire resistance, and should they deal in, I don't really know what they do at the moment, deal in much more detail with kind of fireproof, very resistant escape routes?
Okay. Well, let me start. I think we've all talked about many of these issues. Charlie mentioned the issue of some of the European codes that deal with safe areas in buildings. Well, certainly we have to look at the European codes and some of the other codes around the world as to how they deal with safety for occupants, because that's a very important issue. The question of fire I raised, and I very strongly believe that we really have to re-examine the issue of how we protect our buildings against fire, because I don't think we adequately... There have been high-rise fires, by the way, in the past, not only in the United States but in other countries, and in each case a high-rise fire always presents a problem for the occupants, a problem for the firefighters, and I don't think that has adequately been resolved. And I think all of us have talked about the issue of redundancy. Redundancy is really one of the key issues in any building structure. Charlie?
I think, in a sense, the American practice of architecture and engineering from a design point of view has convinced the public that we design buildings that can't fall down, that we design buildings that will perform, and the expectation of the public is maybe too great. I always like to read the cover of most load standards, which say these are the minimum standards. And I think what's going to happen relative to fire, relative to structural engineering, relative to width of stairs and all of these things is the design community through performance-based design is going to sit down with their owner in the early stages and say, if you want it to the code, this is minimum. What do you really want? And a lot of owners want more than the code. In the past, that never happened. We just kind of gave it to them. And so I think you're going to see a whole different sea change here in the communication between designers and owners.
I have a couple of questions from the floor, which I hope you don't mind. I'm going to paraphrase them for various reasons. One of the questions is, or a paraphrase of that question is, in the future, should more effort be made to design buildings for timely evacuation.
We had a procedure within the
What would happen to the width of the egress stairs in the World Trade Center in terms of size if they had been designed for 100% evacuation of the building?
They would.
At an ENR summit in Washington last Tuesday, and a very prominent architect made a comment to me that he wouldn't live in a building that had scissor stairs. That's where you go like that because of the fact that they're not separated as well as regular stairs. So there are obviously some things about building codes that will change. Interestingly, the Petronas Towers in Malaysia, that double-decker bridge that connects the two towers together is a legal means of egress. And it was a scenario that if there were a fire in the bottom of one tower, people would come down, cross over, and go down the other tower. And as a result, the designers were able to reduce the width of the stairs. Okay? I mean, everybody is always trying to make things smaller, reduce the use of space, and save money. Ironically, if two planes had hit the two towers in Malaysia, that means of egress would have been useless. So.
There's another question. It isn't addressed to any of you in particular. It says, what was the mechanism of the Building 7 collapse?
Well, I think it was discussed this morning. What happened to Building 7 was simply that after the collapse of the two towers, there was a fire that was started in Building 7 because of ancillary damage. There was damage caused by embers that were thrown against the building, and also there was some certain degree of physical damage. The firemen at that time were much too busy trying to save their buddies and friends and to be concerned about the fire in that building. And I believe that that fire was just allowed to burn itself out and cause the collapse of the building. Yes.
Why don't you come up and use the microphone?
There's a microphone.
I'm sorry. Just to set the record straight, we felt it should be said that there was a concerted effort that was planned to, and actually efforts were made to enter that building and fight the fire. And one of our deputy chiefs came to the correct conclusion that that became an unsafe act at some point during the day, and he pulled everybody out. But that building was certainly not abandoned. Just to set the record straight.
Thank you.
Thank you.
There's another question here, which again I'll paraphrase. In the future, should there be some consideration given to using steels that melt at 2,000 to 4,000 degrees Fahrenheit instead of the steels that were used in the World Trade Center?
I would say yes, but there's got to be something. Whenever you gain something, you lose something. So what is the brittle characteristics or the fracture toughness or the weldability? You never get anything for nothing in life.
There's one question here addressed specifically to Matis Levy, and that is, will the World Trade Center incident mark the end of 100-story skyscrapers?
Well, that's a question I almost can't answer, because it's really not a question that has anything to do with structures, or it really has to do with economics and politics. The issue is, do 100-story buildings, or are 100-story buildings economical to build, and will they be built by developers, or are they going to be simply buildings that are symbols either of nations, of companies, of ideas, and will they be built for that reason? There's no good structural reasons why 100-story buildings can't be built and can't be built safely.
The Taipei International World Trade Center is under construction, and it's something in excess of 1,600 feet. It's in Taiwan, and so it's under construction. I don't believe they've stopped. I think they'll keep going. Bill Pedersen swears that his Maury building is going to get built. We will see.
I think that most of the other questions that I received have been addressed fairly completely by the panel. Unless there are more new questions, I think we'll end this session. And excuse me? I don't know of any such questions right now. I don't have any. I don't have any email questions.
Ask it.
Ask it.
That's fine. Let's ask the question from the floor. I have his question, but it has a picture in it.
I found reviewing an article by Leslie Robertson presented in 1972 at the High Rise Building Conference sponsored by ASCE and IAPSE at Lehigh University, August 72. In that presentation, shows a sketch of the World Trade Center in order to point out the role of the 20,000 dampers in the structures, and he refers to primary and secondary floors. There is there is one primary and two secondary floors in that sketch. Is that really true of the actual buildings? In 72, the buildings were already almost complete. That would be an interesting detail.
As I mentioned to you earlier, I really don't know the details.
The secondary floors, according to the sketch, that do have the dampers, but the dampers are between the secondary floors and columns that go to the primary floor. That's how it is. It's an article in a public domain.
It's a detail that I'm not.
Redundancy, and I believe that's about the most important thing in this whole thing, in this whole problem. Have you, in your brief analysis to date, come up with any unique ideas to achieving redundancy that wouldn't be too expensive that we might hear now? Understanding it may take another year or two before final reports come out, but I'd like to think of ideas that I haven't thought of if they're out there. How would I make a redundant structure not much more expensive?
You know, with Mario Salvadori, I wrote a book called Why Buildings Fall Down, which deals with all kinds of failures. And I would say that a majority of those failures are caused really by a lack of redundancy. But each one is unique. It's not as if there were one magic formula that solves all the problems. In the case of a building such as the World Trade Center, clearly there were portions of the building that were highly redundant. The outside tube was highly redundant. It lost, something like 20% of the columns, and yet the building stood up because it was able to redistribute the loads. We don't know what the situation with the core was, and maybe there was insufficient redundancy in the core that should be looked at in the future. But what the exact solution should be, I wouldn't even want to speculate at this point.
I believe that if your client from day one tells you they want redundancy, meaning resistance to the progressive collapse, and you have a team of architects, owners, and contractors and structural engineers that are working together, you can achieve significant improvement in redundancy, and it doesn't cost much. We recently did a project, I won't mention any names, but it's about a 13-story steel frame building and a cast-in-place post-tension garage, and on top of the garage is a trading floor, and it's an institutional owner, and they said, we want progressive collapse resistance in the exterior of our office building, so we put some light moment frames in the exterior and basically formed a Verandeal and took some of the bracing out of the core. We still needed core bracing. Had they not asked that question, we would have done it all in the core on a 13-story building. So yes, we added moment connections where you would have had shear connections. There's a little extra cost for that. In the case of the garage, they wanted both one exterior and one interior column capable of being knocked out without initiating a collapse. And just adding some continuous top and bottom mild steel in the beams worked. So if you know up front, it's not that big a cost impact. All right. Yes, it's more expensive. There's numbers of 1 or 2 or 3% of the total cost of the project, maybe 5, 6, 7, 8% of the structural cost. But I think it depends upon the building. We're doing one right now, and it's a government building in Washington, and we had 40-foot spans, post-tensioned, and on September 12th, we were told to design it for resistance to progressive collapse. Well, a 40-foot PT span, okay, with all that load on the exterior columns is not too good. We now have 20-foot spans, okay, and we have conventional reinforcing, so we can put continuous top and bottom steel and take reversals of load. Now, did that add much money? Probably not, okay, and it caught us right in the beginning of conceptual design. If someone comes along afterwards and you're halfway done, or you want to retrofit, it's a big problem.
In the floor design, to answer your redundancy question,
I think there's another question from the floor.
Just a follow-up of, in the line of what the discussion was regarding the system of design for future tall buildings. Because what we witnessed is something very unusual. It happened under our eyes. Not only the saving of thousands, or like 25,000 people, but the death of 5,000. So we would have to learn from our new realities, as whether we design the same way when regarding the progressive failure, whether we live with the progressive failures, or whether we do something, either shear walls or a new system entirely to prevent the entire structure from going down the way it went. Because this is something that the public at large, it's a matter of public safety here. But the public at large might, if we, the engineers, are not sure about what we're going to do in the future with the design, what would the public at large look at when everybody saw the buildings just go down like a sand castle after a certain period of time? Still, we have to answer and we have to tell them something. We have to come up with something else. If you were to build similar type of buildings, would you go ahead with the same type of light structure that would create these possible progressive failures or not? Would you change something or not?
That's really.
Two issues that you bring up. One is a public safety issue. Public safety issue is addressed primarily by building codes. Building codes specify minimum requirements, and they specify minimum requirements basically for public safety. The issue of what happened at the Trade Center is an unusual situation. Now, we can certainly say that we as engineers have an obligation to look somewhere beyond what the minimum requirements are. But then we have to deal with clients. And as Frank has said, clients then have the ultimate say as to how far they are willing to go in adding to the cost of buildings to provide additional safety beyond that which is required for general public safety.
If I may just interrupt for a moment, I think we're getting a little bit, I'm sorry, you want to reply to that?
I just wanted to go and relate back again to our colleagues on the West Coast. And if anyone has followed the evolution of the NEHRP provisions, the National Earthquake Reduction Hazards Program, the average structural engineer who works for commercial developer owners, basically we comply with the codes, which are a minimum, all right? If you're in another situation and you're dealing with an institutional owner, the institutional owner will generally encourage you to design for more than the minimum standards. But let me give you an example, okay? Engineers are creative and they're innovative in saving their clients money. So the California structural engineers got very clever about 10 years ago, and they started putting one frame in each face of the building. So if you had 10 columns in a row, they would take two columns and one beam, 2 columns and 1 beam, and they would put all the lateral load resistance in one frame in each face of the building, okay? Why? Because then the connections are less expensive in all the other frames. Well, after a few major earthquakes, we realized that, number one, having it all in one frame was not making sense. The losses were showing up, failures were occurring, so now the NEHRP provision has provisions which basically say if you use one frame, your intensity factors are much, much greater. If you use the whole building, your intensity factors are lower. So there's a case where the industry has observed and responded. And that's going to happen in the East, that's going to happen as a result of the Trade Center. You're going to have changes introduced into the code. But it's a consensus process. It's not just engineers that are deciding to do this.
I just wanted to say, actually, we're getting a little bit off of the intention of the forum, and I wanted to explain about questions that were submitted by email. They were split up among the various panels that we thought they would be appropriate for. And of course, some of these sessions are more crowded and there isn't time, but all of them will be handled in one way or another, either on the web or by publications that will come out afterwards. Some of the questions that did not deal with the main purpose of the forum were held back. That is, our purpose here was to look at what happened and how it happened, and not to look ahead necessarily to make recommendations. We wanted to collect information here. And the idea of this is that everyone would start with the same information, at least of this group, so that we can all have some input into what we might do in the future. So some of the questions that are coming up now really pertain to what will be done in a later workshop, perhaps, which we have in mind for perhaps in June. So I would ask you all to save those questions, and in fact, if you have input, to make that input to our website or to the work that's going to be going on in preparation for the second workshop. I think we still have a few more minutes. If you have questions relating to the collapse mechanisms in terms of what happened, I think those are the appropriate questions for this forum.
So, former captain in the New York City Fire Department, 32 years. Recently gone over to Polytech University. And my question is not really a question, more of a statement. To refocus, I mean, I'm very well aware that in this room and up on the panel are policymakers. They're going to help design the buildings of the future. And for 32 years, we've been focused in the fire department on saving lives and property. And it's very interesting for me to sit here and hear all the different theories about how to save a building. And I think we lose the focus on saving the lives. And when the subject was brought up about better evacuation methods, it became maybe not cost effective. And there's talk about what the client wants. Well, I think the future client wants a safer building that they can get the hell out of, no matter what's going on in the building. This is a whole different forum if everyone escapes the building and the building collapses. Now we sit back and we say, okay, what was the mechanism? But please don't lose focus on the lives that were lost. 343 firefighters died trying to bring the last person that we could possibly bring out. Okay, so don't tell me that it's not cost effective to make stairwells or systems to evacuate the building. That's the point. There are probably 20 different scenarios that are gonna happen. They're gonna make you evacuate the building. Whether a system in the building breaks down, whether there's some bad air in the building, no matter, you can think of 20 different scenarios, a threat, a bomb threat. If we don't evacuate the building successfully in an acceptable amount of time, there's going to be a life loss. And if there's one person left in the building, you're going to lose firefighters because they're going to go in and get them. That's what we're focused on. So let's not lose the focus, okay? And I understand everyone here is a policymaker at some point. Let's not lose the focus of the fire department's mission. We're going to go in and save lives. We trust the people in this room to design the buildings to get the life hazard out. If the life hazard is removed, it's an academic question. Please don't lose sight of that. Thank you.
I think that this is time to bring this session to an end. If there are any further questions, they can be submitted in writing. I think some of them can be then addressed. Thank you very much. I thank the panel for their time.
Right there, second row.
Where is it?
You'll be the brightest light the world has ever seen, the dizzy height of a jet-set life. You could never dream. Your pale blue eyes, strawberry hair, lips so sweet, skin so fair, your future bright, beyond compare. It's rise to riches over there. Just to see me stand over my bed, disbelieving what they see. They say I must be one of the wonders, God's own creation, and as far as they see, they can offer no explanation. Newspapers ask intimate questions, want confessions. They reach into my head to steal the glory of my story. They say I must be one of the wonders, God's own creation, and as far as they see, they can offer no explanation.
Could we sit down, please, so we might start the next session? Well, this next session was genuinely at risk since it was entitled Managerial and Technical Aspects of Emergency Response Operations. And as you well know, there was some call for emergency response this morning, so that the panel has changed considerably and narrowed down. And that's the reason that we're able to start a little bit later and not worry about going overtime. The moderators, however, are all here, and the chair of the session will be Klaus Jacob of Lamont Doherty at Columbia University, Professor Bud Griffiths, late of Columbia University, currently of Polytechnic University, and Michael Garvin, professor at Columbia University.
Thank you, Rene. This will be the session where we have, at the moment, at least more moderators than panelists. Let me introduce the two that are presently here, and let me point out who could not make it, up to this moment at least. For the fire department of New York City, we have John Flynn, to my left. Sitting in for John Norman, who is Chief of Operations, Special Operations, who had obviously to leave earlier today. We will start with John Flynn. He got a Manhattan College degree in '82 as an engineer, and I understand actually worked for a while with Bud Griffiths. I assume these are during the Army Corps of Engineer times. He's a registered New York State civil structural engineer and a lieutenant with the New York City Fire Department. Then we have Dan Kuoko, who is the president of LZA Technology, part of the Thornton Tomasetti Group, who has a Bachelor of Civil Engineering from City College of New York, a Master of Science in Civil Engineering at NYU, and a Master of Business Administration at Adelphi University. To come back to the first panelist, John Flynn spent the first 2 to 3 weeks on Ground Zero on behalf of the fire department and has been since there off and on. Please, John Flynn. He has not prepared a presentation which was with John Norman, so we'll temporize and will give us at least a statement for the fire department as a first responder.
Thank you. Yeah, as was stated, I'm filling in for John Norman, and he's the Chief of Special Operations on my job. It's a pretty weighty position. I'm not sure exactly what he was going to speak about, but I think I had enough experience at the site to speak on behalf of the fire department. Many years ago, I went to a class, 11 years ago to be exact, a class sponsored by FEMA, which trains you as a structural specialist on an urban search and rescue disaster response team. These teams were formed as a result of the Loma Prieta earthquake, at which it was recognized there was not a organized federal response. So the idea was developed to come up with a network of teams around the country. And these teams were outfitted with various positions, among which was the structural specialist. When I attended my first class there, I was in class with 50 engineers. And I was the only one who also happened to be a firefighter. And I recognized within the first 10 minutes that there was a tremendously diametrically opposed philosophy, because where the engineer will say, nobody should go in there, the firefighter will say, you can't keep me out. And I think the proper response lies somewhere in the middle. I think firefighters as a whole have to learn to become a little bit more pensive and educated. And I think that engineers as a whole have to become a little bit more considerate of the response considerations which firefighters have to deal with at the scene. That said, I'll talk about some of the things that that I feel were important at the site. I believe that that is the focus of my presentation, so I'll concentrate on that. Okay, what I hope to come out of the response based upon my observations. Engineers, I'll deal with the engineering perspective first. I think, as stated previously, engineers have to consider from now on, I think, a little bit more. They'll have to place more emphasis on major damage to a structure and consider alternate load paths. I think that there was an absence of this, despite the fact that the World Trade Center was designed so elegantly and so efficiently. I think that an omission was made in the design, in the sense that it really was not a good building to respond to a fire in. Truss construction has long been known to the fire service as being very dangerous. And the reason we know that is we've lost a lot of firefighters in truss constructed buildings. The fire protection measures that are taken are all too frequently compromised, even in an incident which doesn't involve a 767. We have to be very, very conscious of the surface area of our structural elements and how well they're protected. Okay. Secondly, and perhaps even more importantly, we have to consider a design which allows rapid and efficient egress. Let's take a look at the World Trade Center. It's 110 stories tall. If you're on the 100th floor and an incident occurs and it takes you 30 seconds to traverse from one floor to the next, that's 50 minutes. That's almost exactly how long it took for that first tower to collapse. That's not barring unforeseen things like people who can't make it down the stairs, handicapped people, the firefighters who were physically exhausted after climbing 20 stories. They were looking for oxygen. We carry 80 pounds on our back. So the engineering world has to be more cognizant of that. And I know that to this date, the engineering profession has been largely client-driven, and we've heard that said repeatedly this morning. But I hope that my profession of engineering will become more responsible to my profession of firefighting by recognizing that they have to play a more proactive role in determining what is going to take place within the design. And I think insist that certain provisions be made for egress, whether it's the size of the stairway, the number of stairways, the protection of the stairway within the core. The only intact, I won't go there. The stairways in these buildings were the least compromised elements in the building. Despite that, people didn't get out. By the way, as stated earlier, it does not have to be a terrorist event. This could have been an accident. A 767 could fly into those buildings accidentally. It can also be a biological or chemical incident that causes people to flee. So the fact that it was, the building did its job. I'm not sure we did our job by providing adequate egress. Okay, thirdly, a design which permits reliable and protected elevators, because many of the firefighters had to walk as a result of the elevators being compromised. just a thought, special elevators for access. And ease of communications, it was alluded to earlier. I know for a fact that certain orders were given to evacuate the building. I also know that certain firefighters did not hear them because our radios don't work very well in high-rise buildings once you go beyond a certain point, especially vertically when you have floors in between. Communications we take for granted here in the engineering world that, the communications will be there. And I assure you that even at the simplest fire operation, very often you cannot communicate. And that is a real-life problem. And very importantly, my fifth point is the avoidance of large open floor areas. I'm not sure if there's any other building in the world, I could be wrong about this, but where you get an acre of floor space under one roof. And this was a contributing factor. Compartmentalization would serve two purposes. It would provide the redundancy in the alternate load paths. It would also keep the fire confined to definable areas where it wouldn't cause the global disastrous effects. Okay. Now, the fire department and the fire service in general. I think the fire department also has some responsibilities to bear. I think that firefighters in general have to become better educated. We have to learn, as firefighters, the way a building is constructed, the materials it's constructed out of, and its propensity for sudden failure, whether global or local. And I'll be the first to admit that the fire service as a whole, and largely through no fault of their own, because we have to remember this is the first time we've been faced with this type of incident. Secondly, we have to give a little bit of a more thoughtful approach to our response. Tradition says that you go into the building. Firefighters are very, very proud people. They're very, very brave people, and they live to save people. And if there's one person in the building, a fireman is going to be in there trying to get him, probably a lot more than one firefighter. And we have to consider ways to do that in a more safe manner. It's been preferred that we provide a structural engineer in a response. I think there's some problems associated with that, given that you have to enter some very dangerous situations to determine whether or not something is safe. And it's going to take a very, very special type of person to make that entry. These people do exist. I've seen them on the FEMA teams. There's I believe, 28 FEMA teams around the country right now. Each of them has 2 structural specialists. They're professional engineers, and they're structural engineers who come from the private sector generally, and they work with the fire department teams in determining not only the level of risk, but what needs to be done to effect a safe rescue. And they're a nice hybrid between engineer and firefighter. And I saw them operate down at the World Trade Center, and they were very effective when they were given the chance to operate, which unfortunately came a little bit late given the magnitude of the circumstances. Also, we have to have better communication amongst our own department. I think we have to utilize our resources to their fullest. We have to institute our own inside educational programs devoted to firefighter and civilian safety. Emotion cannot rule. Emotion cannot be allowed to rule. We have to make practical decisions. So, lastly, I think private fire departments, public fire departments should elicit support from the private sector. I think the engineering world, again, not only in the consideration of the design, but possibly in the education of firefighters. We have to get more involved with state-of-the-art. Our responses are based on 100-year-old buildings, taxpayers, brownstones. And what we're seeing is a lot of different types of construction that many firefighters are unfamiliar with. And we're going to try and educate ourselves, but any assistance that can be afforded to the firefighting community from the private sector would be well placed. So I guess that's about all I have to say. I think next time the response will be a little, if there is a next time, God forbid, next time the response will be more organized. It'll be more efficient. We'll get our act together a little bit better. We'll try and get more engineers who understand buildings on the site rather than 2,000 or 3,000 firefighters crawling through debris. At an earlier stage, possibly we can figure out some way to have them work together for a reasoned response. Thank you.
Thank you, John, for this very good ad hoc introduction in the problems that the fire department faces and where you see it. Our next contribution will be from Dan Kuroko from LCA Technology, and he was involved ground zero management from day one into the present.
Okay. Do I have to do anything to this to make it go?
Can we have the video? The PowerPoint?
Okay.
Thanks.
There we go. Okay, thank you. What I would like to do is really focus on the managerial aspects and the technical aspects of the response of the city, the contractors, and the structural engineers down at the site. We got a call, I guess, on the 17th, the 11th, September 11th. And basically, the city immediately responded after the event. The Office of Emergency Management of the Mayor's Office, through DDC, Department of Design and Construction, immediately retained 4 major construction management firms, Bovis Len Lease, Tully Construction, Turner Plaza Construction, and AMEC, which was the old Morse Diesel company, and to handle whatever was needed at the site. Also retained our firm to handle all the structural engineering operations that would be necessary. DDC set up this organization chart where basically you could see there was one person who pretty much handled all the daily meetings on a day-to-day basis, Mike Burton, who reported to Ken Holden, who was here earlier and obviously had to be called away due to things this morning. And the organization was set up where basically there was a DDC team that was involved with each of the contracting firms, which are on the lower portion of the slide there, as well as with the engineering teams that were under our direction. The way the site was divided, the city, I think, realized that there wasn't really one firm